Hello, welcome, good evening. This is Novara Live. I am, of course, Bastani. I'm joined tonight by who else? The one and only Helena, aka No Justice MTG. Helena, how are we?
I'm doing very, very well. It has been a very, very busy week. It has been true, but I'm glad to be able to join an unusual Friday lineup today.
I'm really looking forward to tonight's show. We had not much time to prepare. As you might have noticed, I'm not Michael Walker. I don't often host on a Friday. It's been busy, but I think this is going to be a very snappy, interesting, fun show. Coming up tonight, yet another anti-migrant protest is set to take place, this time in London. Meanwhile, Tommy Robinson is AWOL. A journalist who was instrumental in the takedown of a BBC documentary on Gaza is now taking aim at the Labour government, and Tucker Carlson appears to be aligning himself with the Palestinian cause. If you'd like to support our work here at Novara Media, you know what to do. Sign up at novaramedia.com/support. Help us build a new media for different politics. Forward, I should have said, not forward. What's going on? Freudian slip. Donald Trump has imposed tariffs again. The US president has signed an executive order imposing rates ranging from 10 to 41% on dozens of trade partners and punishing some of the world's poorest countries. India has been hit with a 25% tariff on exports to the US. It's 30% for South Africa, reflecting Trump's strained relationship with the South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa, and 20% for Taiwan. Brazil has been hit with an eye-watering 40% as Trump tries to punish the country for prosecuting its former president, Jair Bolsonaro, who inspired his supporters to storm the seat of government after he lost an election in Washington in 2020. Democratic Senator Adam Schiff accused Trump of using the tariffs to support dictators. Here's what he said.
So in case you missed it, Trump a couple of weeks ago imposed 50% tariffs on Brazil. What is this all about? Well, first of all, we have a positive trade balance with Brazil. So why on earth would we impose or get involved in a trade war with Brazil? And the answer has nothing to do with trade. The answer has to do with the fact that Brazil, unlike the United States, is holding their former president and chief insurrectionist to account. Bolsonaro, this strongman that Trump so admires, led an insurrection against the election in which he lost, and he is being prosecuted in Brazil. Well, obviously, Trump doesn't like that because Trump apparently wants to make another American export be the export of insurrection against free and fair elections. So he puts on these tariffs against Brazil, but not content with trying to use trade in this way to bolster this wannabe dictator in Brazil. He is imposing sanctions on the judge in the case presiding over the Bolsonaro trial. This is just shocking. And with all the other terrible stuff going on, I didn't want you to fail to see this. Donald Trump placing sanctions on a judge trying another former president, wannabe dictator, insurrectionist, Bolsonaro, imposing trade tariffs. This is the policy of the United States of America. We have gone far from supporting democratic governance around the world to the point where we are using the levers of our power to help install anti-democratic dictators.
What has happened to the United States of America that it's using its power, its geopolitical heft, its economic might to install anti-democratic dictators? That's a massive shift from the America of the last 100 years. What a tragedy. What a shame. How could they? That man, by the way, Mr. Schiff, was formerly the chair of the House Representation Committee on Intelligence. I think that's what they call it, right? A bit like a select committee over here. Anyway, he's meant to be basically on top of US foreign policy and espionage and spycraft and all these things. Basically, doesn't seem to have much of an idea about how the world works when it comes to US machinations overseas. Helena, that said, it's easy for me to poo-poo what he's saying. It's still quite a significant intervention. What did you make of it?
Well, yeah, I think I would echo your sentiments. There are probably plenty of people in South America, very specifically, who are going to look at those comments and go, well, hang on a minute. What? Yeah, that's just America doing what it does best. So I think it's a very interesting intervention in that regard. What is interesting is the shift in rhetoric insofar as the attack on Trump's tariffs from the Democrats have principally come from the idea that it will increase inflation and it's essentially a tax on consumers. Because whilst there may be some cases where businesses will absorb the tariffs or the import prices will go down in terms of the exporters elsewhere to ensure they remain competitive within America, the broad consensus is that the vast majority of these tariffs are going to get paid by American citizens in the form of, well, they're import duties. They will increase the cost of goods and services, and there will be an inflationary effect. That has been the main criticism of the Democrats towards Trump's tariff policy. When actually, I think a lot of Americans kind of support the idea of tariffs in certain situations. They supported the first round of tariffs, and indeed they supported those same tariffs when they were bolstered by the Biden administration, when it was actually targeting completed products, completed commodities such as Chinese cars, for example, or chips and things like that, which did genuinely help American manufacturing and American consumers and American workers. Whereas these kind of blanket tariffs being used for geopolitical reasons are only going to have an inflationary effect. But the Democrats kind of running on this line of saying, oh, look what's going to happen to the cost of living. This thing that you literally elected Donald Trump because he said he would fix. But unfortunately, most people who have supported the tariffs don't see them as being paid by themselves and won't listen to people who try and convince them that they will. So they've broadly got this idea into their heads that Trump is bringing manufacturing back, which isn't true. You have to target tariffs, not blanket tariffs, for this to work. It's a means of geopolitical maneuvering, and always has been, really, from day one. It's always been a way of trying to bully other countries into being able to do what the Trump administration wants. The problem is, of course, is that we saw from the election that appeals to democratic norms, appeals to diplomatic or humanitarian international diplomatic role for the United States has no basis in United States democratic politics, especially not since that's been what America has supported for, as you say, the last century of geopolitics and international diplomacy. So that they really are kind of running out of ways to attack the Trump administration over this, and it seems like they're just trying to throw whatever it seems at the wall to try and see what sticks. When in reality, they just have to concentrate on the things that are really salient, such as the Epstein files, such as the problems in terms of the reality of the cost of living crisis. And so you're going to have to wait until the inflationary crisis does hit. You're going to have to wait until the additional deficits that they're spending on tax cuts to the rich hits inflation as interest rates stay high, and then show the reality of that is to the American people. And until all of those economic effects pass through the system, they're going to be shouting into the void, unfortunately.
I think Brazil is a really interesting example, though, because it's one of the very few countries, major economies, that the US runs a trade surplus with. In goods, right? Not in services, not, Facebook and Google and legal services and banking. In physical goods, manufactured goods, the US runs a surplus with Brazil. If you were listening to what Trump says, we want to reindustrialize, we want to stop losing our manufacturing jobs to overseas, and we're going to use tariffs as a way to address that, you wouldn't be placing tariffs on Brazil, right? You wouldn't be placing tariffs on Brazil. Doesn't make sense. And the things you're importing from Brazil is fundamentally agricultural goods. You can't grow coffee in Florida, right? So it doesn't make any sense to be placing these kinds of tariffs on Brazil. It's a political tool. It's a very blunt weapon. I probably disagree with you a little bit, Helena, or maybe not. I mean, you didn't really go into detail. On something like European cars, German cars, yeah, sure. You might, as an American president, say, you know what? We've bottom lined their security from a potentially revanchist Russia for 35 years. They haven't spent much on their militaries. You know what? I'm going to put a 35% tariff on luxury German cars. One of several things is going to happen. Yes, the US consumer will be hit to pay more for those cars. They're a luxury good anyway, so what? Or more of those cars will be made in the United States. Or US nationals buy more cars that are made in the United States, but not by German or European car exporting firms. I suspect it'll be a mix of all three. I can see why you do that. I can't see why you'd put tariffs on Brazil if you were serious about reindustrialization. Canada's tariff has gone up from 25% to 35%, supposedly after failing to cooperate in stopping fentanyl entering the US. In a statement, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has said that came despite the fact that Canada accounts for only 1% of US fentanyl imports and has been working intensively to further reduce these volumes. Mexico gets a temporary reprieve as the deadline for a deal was extended another 90 days. That's because US firms make a ton of stuff in Mexico. And predictably, global markets are down and the US dollar has fallen by 1.09%. The US job market has taken a significant hit too. The US Bureau of Labor Statistics report that 73,000 jobs were added in July, down from a projected 147,000. Even Fox News had to admit that something is going wrong.
Good morning, everybody. Let's start with the PCE price index. This is the number that the Fed pegs its 2% inflation target to. It came in hotter than expected, rising for the second month, 2.6%. The expectation was 2.5% on an annual basis. That was a little bit hotter.
Helena, look, I think this stuff can get overblown. It's going to crash the US economy. I don't think it's going to crash the US economy. I do think in some ways, and this is what I found really interesting, Trump is just trying to do what Biden was doing before, which is to bring manufacturing jobs back to the US. Biden was using things like the CHIPS Act, IRA, and it was very successful under Biden in terms of getting businesses out of places like Germany. Intel, for instance, they pulled back on a big investment they were going to make, I think, in Poland and another European country. That's now not going to happen because of the tariffs. Biden was using more of a carrot than a stick, but fundamentally they wanted to achieve the same thing. Do you think that lots of the liberal analysis on this stuff, it's all going to fail, it can't work, it's only going to hit the US consumer? Is there a part of you that thinks, you know what, we might not be entirely right?
I mean, I've always said from the start of this whole tariff business that it's perfectly reasonable to engage in protectionist trade policy. American workers have not benefited from the kind of NAFTA era of politics where they've been subject to a wage arbitrage with other countries throughout, not only in the global south, but in the global north as well, because of the strength of the American currency and because of the strength of the American economy. The issue, of course, is that when it came to the first round of Trump tariffs in his first term and the Biden round of tariffs, again, the vast majority of these tariffs went on completed products, right? Because America relies on imports of things like lumber from Canada very, very heavily. That's not a completed product that American workers are creating and competing with Canada for. In the vast majority of cases, that's a natural resource that then goes into the construction of products that then you would want to sell, and then you would place tariffs on those completed products to ensure that you can't get outcompeted by cheaper labor overseas. But putting a tariff on Canada, on imports, on goods imports that involve one of like the critical components that you need for huge amounts of the kind of American economy. In fact, there are plenty of component parts for the auto industry in America. A really big part of the manufacturing base that's still there relies on the manufacture of individual component parts that get manufactured in Canada and in Mexico. So there's a real big problem that they have where this continual like free trade paradigm that's been created for a long time, which Milton Friedman probably made some pretty good arguments for in that era, where you can find certain specialisms that don't just go into the end product, but in the different component parts of an end product that's manufactured somewhere, and you can bring all of those specialisms together in one place to make a product in the best manner possible. Sure, I buy those arguments, right? But if you want to protect workers who complete the end product, you have to tariff the end product that's coming in. Again, tariffs on luxury cars from Germany, tariffs on electric cars from China, tariffs on microchips coming out of whatever country they might be being manufactured in. Obviously, China is a competitor for the United States, which was the reason for the CHIPS Act, is a reasonable way of doing it. But as you say, like that's different when you say that you do a tariff on the entirety of a geopolitical bloc in the case of the European Union, right? Or on an entire enemy country like China, when it's being done for geopolitical reasons. That doesn't make American work more, or it doesn't make American labor more valuable, because you're just increasing the price of the whole process of production by increasing the cost of all imports, of all component parts and all natural resources that aren't able to be manufactured or created or mined in the United States. So that's actually making American manufacturing less competitive, when they could move to the country where all of those natural resources are, where labor is potentially cheaper, or indeed where they can import the component parts necessary for production without having to pay for a ludicrous tariff like 40% in some cases. So there is obviously an argument for protectionist trade policy. It's amusing that in the UK we always looked at the EU referendum as being a referendum on free trade, when in reality, the EU is a protectionist bloc. It protects Europe as a whole. So you can have internal wage arbitrage and internal kind of free market dynamics within the European Union, but it's fundamentally there to protect European manufacturers from wage arbitrage outside the EU. So we had people who supported protectionism in the UK supporting leaving the European Union, which was being pushed by free marketeers so that we could get free trade deals with India and with the United States and with the global South. So there's a real problem in terms of the way we talk about trade policy in this country and the way in which that trade policy is being talked about in the United States, as I said, which is being used as a geopolitical tool. When Biden was doing it, fully supported it, because on top of those tariffs, he was also doing a massive, huge industrial policy expansionary regime in terms of monetary policy. They run 7% deficits in some cases. And because this was going into the supply side, this wasn't creating an inflationary effect. That was already happening before we saw the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, right? The IRA brought down the cost of commodities because it put more money into the supply side of the economy. And that's a level of industrial support that you need to make your protectionist policy work. Is the Trump campaign doing industrial policy? No. In fact, all the industrial policy that happened under Joe Biden, they're cancelling that. They cancelled things from the Inflation Reduction Act, which goes directly into a lot of Republican states. A lot of, like Marjorie Taylor Greene in Georgia was talking about the new jobs that were created in green energy in her district. And those subsidies are being removed by the Trump administration to pay for tax cuts to billionaires. They're going to get used for stock buybacks. So whilst the narrative is certainly been brought up by the American right and the free trade era is certainly dying out, right? Not necessarily the end of globalization, but unilateral neoliberal free trade as being as far less popular than it was 30 years ago. The idea that it's going to help American consumers, the idea that it's going to bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States when they're doing all of the things against what is necessary to ensure the survival of these industries, shows that I think the Trump tariff plan, the Big Beautiful Bill, and his broader macroeconomic policy is going to be devastating for the United States working class.
The interesting one for me is Taiwan. Imagine you're little Taiwan, you've got Xi looking over. He said, I want you guys. You've got TSMC, this $1 trillion company producing some of the most advanced microprocessors in the world to make the most cutting edge technologies. Basically, if you want really top AI, you need to use the chips made by these guys. Okay, or made in Taiwan for the most part. They're made by companies like Nvidia, for instance, but they're processed, they're manufactured in the fabs in Taiwan, right? So you're integral to the global supply chain for leading edge consumer electronics, and you're thinking, well, look, the Americans are going to look after us because if they lose us to China, they're screwed. And Trump's saying, you know what? I want a 20% tariff on everything you sell us. Is that how you're going to treat your client states? Doesn't seem very wise. And if you're doing that so that those fabs then move to the US, which, by the way, they're not going to build a whole new fab, cutting-edge fab that the likes of TSMC or Intel or Samsung build, you're looking at $20-30 billion for one site. That's before training up the people. That's before all manner of things. Do you have the intellectual supply chains? Do you have the right number of engineers, et cetera, et cetera? Yeah, okay. In California, you have that. Where in Europe do you have that? Where on the east coast of the US do you have that? You certainly aren't going to have that in low tax jurisdictions in the US, right? You're not going to have loads of really talented engineers in Delaware saying, yes, we can make, these ultra thin microprocessors to power all your AI applications. So if that's the point of these tariffs, for the production to be relocated, you might as well be saying to Taiwan, as Donald Trump, we don't need you. We want your fabs to move, and then you can go. You can be the last holdout, the last fallen holdout, the last conquest of China's civil war, of the successful People's Revolution. That's basically what it is. If you're placing those tariffs on Taiwan with that reason in mind. Yet another anti-migrant protest is set to take place tomorrow, this time in North London. A group of people claiming to be locals, concerned about alleged crimes carried out by asylum seekers housed in the Barbican Thistle Hotel in Islington, will gather outside that building at 2 p.m. And a counter-demo is planned as well. Anti-racists will gather from 12:30 outside the hotel to oppose them. Protests against hotels housing migrants have taken place across the country over the past few weeks. But how did this particular protest in Islington come about? Well, in June, the Shadow Home Secretary posted a video of himself visiting the hotel, claiming to find evidence of illegal working.
As Shadow Home Secretary, I received reports there was illegal working going on at an asylum hotel in central London by illegal immigrants. So I decided to go around and check it out. So we're at the hotel here. You can see there's a lot of Just Eat bikes here, a lot of Deliveroo bikes, loads of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, loads and loads of these bikes here. They look as if they're being used for delivery company work. Uber Eats, I can see an Uber Eats bike over there as well. Lots and lots of these bikes here. So let's try and find out a bit more about what's going on. What's going on with you guys here? It's an asylum hotel. You guys have arrived here. I'm Chris. I'm a member of Parliament, just interested in learning a little more about what the story is here. How long have you guys been here for? Little English. Whereabouts are you from? From Yemen. Yemen, you're from Yemen. Okay. And did you get here by boat?
Christ. If that's how you make a video, no wonder you couldn't run the country. I can't see anything. I can't hear anything. You know, we should post that on social media and give it a new title. What happens when you get a Tory former minister to make a video? Surprise, surprise, it's shit. At the time of that video, an asylum seeker called Illy told local paper, the Islington Tribune, how the stunt had affected him. What hurts the most is reading comments on social media where people say their taxes are being wasted on asylum seekers. It breaks me. We're not here to take. We're here because we had no choice. We're not enjoying this life. We are surviving it. I want to work and pay taxes just like everyone else. I want my taxes to one day support the same people who now say we are a burden. That was Illy from Afghanistan. Apparently, he had to flee the Taliban because he was teaching female children. He was teaching IT to girls. Warehousing asylum seekers in hotels is a policy that pleases no one. But it's a hangover from Tory mismanagement of the migration system. And now, Phil, himself a former Tory minister, is criticising asylum seekers and blaming the current government. But Chris, you were in the last one. Helena, I was watching that. As we were watching it, it started, and Alex, our producer here, said, you know, more Tory vigilantism. You've got Robert Jenrick as well. My read now when I see these videos coming out from, less so Jenrick, of course, because he wants to be the leader, but Chris Philp, is that this is desperation, right? They're so far away from power and the levers of power, and they're polling so poorly, these guys have just got to do anything for clicks. You know, I'm half expecting Chris Philp to skydive over Westminster in his underpants, you know, wearing a shower cap just to get some attention. Do you think what they're doing is working? Because maybe on the issue, we can have a separate conversation. But in terms of the Tories, you know, these videos get shared to hell. They go far and wide, but it's not being reflected in people wanting to vote for them.
I mean, when Robert Jenrick did his video where he confronted the people skipping the barriers at tube stations, right, went pretty viral on social media. And I think what he and Chris Philp are trying to tap into is this idea of a broken social contract, right? Kemi Badenoch doesn't seem to understand this because she's too busy moaning about David Tennant and the Chega silence. But it seems to be that the plotters in the background, not that I'm saying that they are, but they could potentially be if there is a potential leadership challenge around the horizon, which you'd think there would be given the state of their polling. The angle they're going for is the Nick age 30 meme, where people realize that if they work in the private sector and they pay taxes, and then there's all these different special interest groups who get paid money by the government for nothing. Now, I fundamentally reject this because a lot of these causes are very, very just to be able to ensure we spend money on protecting asylum seekers because it's our duty under the Refugee Convention. But they're trying to push this idea that there is a breakdown in society and the people who are paying for it are the hard-working Middle Englanders of this world. You know, that's what they're trying to push for. Do I think that this is working? Well, on the same week where Robert Jenrick went literally viral on social media for this, on like Twitter or whatever, which is full of people who are just trying to share videos to make sure that their Twitter Blue accounts pay them some revenue. When he was invited onto Trevor Phillips's Sky News show, which they do every Sunday morning, Zia Yusuf was on at the same time, and so was a government minister. And the government minister and Zia Yusuf both got tens of thousands of views, 50, 60,000 views. Robert Jenrick couldn't break 5 figures. So whether or not this viral social media campaign is actually fomenting the idea of conservative politics or the Conservative Party as an electoral force. I don't think it is. I think Reform UK really do control the airwaves on this. What I will point out, though, when it comes to this whole discussion around asylum seekers working, I'm just like, well, you either hate them for being scroungers or you hate them for taking the jobs. You can't do it at the same time. They're one or the other. And quite frankly, unless you understand that both demand and supply have elements in terms of how labour is distributed in this country, keeping them to not work is only going to be a net negative. Get these people jobs, right? If your complaint here is that the underpaid person who was acting as my private burger taxi might have arrived here via irregular means, then quite frankly, I think you need to get some real problems in your life rather than complaining about this stuff. But regardless, the issue is when it comes to the broken migration policy is that on the continent, they have special built asylum detention centres because they've been dealing with the fallout from Syria and from Libya because that's where the direct route to Europe is from. We haven't dealt with this until we were outside the Dublin Protocol since we left the European Union. That's why we don't have any purpose-built accommodation. The Tories made big bang bucks over this by being able to take government money and shovel it into the pockets of hoteliers that had links to the Conservative Party, and then try and blaming the new government for the problem that they didn't prepare for in 14 years and then created because they wanted to spend 7 times what it would cost for a disposal policy to put these people in hotels because they wanted to create a flashpoint for the kind of protests that we're seeing at the moment really does leave a sour taste. But then again, I think most people in this country don't want to hear the migrants cost this much less, the asylum seekers are working and paying taxes. The only answer that they want to hear is there are no asylum seekers, which as long as we sign up to the Refugee Convention, no government could admit that they can't do.
Yeah, it's a case of Schrodinger's asylum seeker, right? Either they're working really hard and they're doing the jobs we don't want to do, or they're breaking the law and they're scrounging money. And I'm sure, look, some will break the law. Some will work really hard. It's a range of people. But it seems inconsistent to say, I oppose this process en masse because of this, and then I oppose it for saying for a wholly different reason. I mean, also on Uber Eats and Deliveroo, the entire business model of these companies is built on 2 things: cheap credit, low interest rates, and cheap labor. It's built on cheap labor. It's built on highly precarious labor markets, no trade unions. You know, if you had closed shop trade unions in food logistics and delivery, this wouldn't happen, right? If you had 1930s style post-Wagner Act US labor industrial relations, this would not happen. To become a delivery driver, you have to be a member of the union, you have to have the credentials, etc. Of course, they would earn more money then. But the Tories and the right, and I'm just talking particularly now about Uber Eats and people, delivering food, they want cheap labor. They want it, very precarious. No trade unions. Labor market, very elastic and flexible. You can work 1 minute in Manchester, the next minute in London, the next minute in West Bromwich, the next minute in Belfast. They want all those things, but they also want a settled population that's somehow going to be homeowners and will have traditional values. They don't understand that the economic base has an impact on the social and cultural superstructure. If you have an economy built on cheap, heavily exploited, highly precarious labor, then yes, this kind of thing is going to happen. Uber Eats, they know what they're doing. They know what they're doing. In July, the Mail on Sunday ran a classic tabloid scare story. Exclusive: hundreds of migrants living in taxpayer-funded hotels across the UK accused of offences including rape, sex, attacks, robbery, theft, and violence. That's after tens of thousands of people who passed through migrant accommodation over the past 3 years led to that finding of 312 people who had been charged with crimes. And of course, that doesn't include people that have been acquitted or those who've been found guilty of any crime. Now, I know what somebody might say. They might say, well, look, we have enough wrong uns in this country and we don't need more of them. And that's a coherent, fair point. But the point of the media, the point of a newspaper, the point of Novara media is clarity and accuracy. Okay? Clarity and accuracy. Saying 312 people have been charged with, that's not really very clear. Out of how many people are we talking? How many have been acquitted? How many have actually been found guilty of something? And Nathan Phillips from the migrant charity Asylum Matters said this: describing this as a migrant crime wave is not only completely dishonest, but incredibly dangerous at a time when families forced to live in asylum hotels are being threatened on their doorstep by violent crowds. The day after the Mail published its article, a Facebook group was set up calling for a protest outside the Barbican Thistle for this Saturday. The protest has been endorsed by Stephen Yaxley Lennon, aka Tommy Robinson. The far-right figure won't be there himself, mind. That's because he's in Tenerife. He went there this week as the police looked to question him over an alleged assault that took place at St Pancras Station. I shouldn't laugh. If you were there, you'd be like, is that guy dead? He's definitely unconscious. What did he break? Did he break a nose? I mean, I should have checked this out. I mean, I don't actually know the state of the guy. It's definitely ABH. It's definitely ABH, Tommy. You're definitely going to jail, buddy. Is it GBH? And also, he's a big dude, right? I mean, wow, what happened? What happened? Of course, nobody can ask that question to Tommy Robinson because he's left the country. Helena, this is a funny question, I guess. Do you think Tommy Robinson has an addiction to being arrested? Do you think he loves the drama? It seems almost surreal at this point.
I mean, the one thing that both, for example, political parties and media institutions and indeed the influencer types, because he's basically an influencer at this point, a political influencer, Tommy Robinson, the thing they want is clicks. They want to have a following and they need to be able to weaponize that for revenue. So what's the best way of being able to get publicity? Well, you can get yourself arrested, you know? I mean, of course, I don't think that he punched this guy because he wanted to get publicity for being arrested. If he indeed did assault this guy, I don't know whether the facts of this have been made clear at all at this point in time, but it certainly doesn't look particularly good if you then flee the country when these things happen. You know, there's hardly impairs him wanting to oppress his innocence upon the rest of us. But regardless of the reality of the situation, I don't personally know. When it comes to things like the article that you showed at the start there with, well, look at this migrant crime wave, we've got these statistics that we've kind of chopped and changed and made it look worse than it really is. Well, the reality is that in a world in which media publications don't sell paper copies as much as they used to, they mostly are driven in terms of revenue from AdSense on the internet, which involves making sure people click on it, making sure people re-engage over and over again. That the paper platforms rely on having a continual kind of user base or consumer base who buy into it and can keep consuming day after day, who become repeat readers. And that involves ensuring that you have some kind of mission statement that they buy into. When it comes to online media, people themselves are looking for a headline that they can post. The news organizations want a headline that they can post to get people to click to be able to generate AdSense revenue. That's it. Like the death of subscription media, you know, like for example, you look at Byline Times, who essentially they don't charge for viewing the content, but they ask for paid subscribers to keep them going in the same way that we do. It's a much different business model than needing revenue from just AdSense and clicks and making sure that you go viral. So all those kind of hack statistics are really important. The same is true of political parties, by the way. Like they need a dedicated base of people who are going to continue getting engaged. And in the world of the engagement in the world of the engagement and attention economy, that involves ensuring these people stay engaged. And so you have to keep pushing out these kind of statistics that keep people angry and keep people ready to engage politically. So, for example, there's a really great TikToker called Sneaker who put out this video, I believe it was yesterday, talking about a think tank, quote unquote, that just got set up seemingly overnight called the Centre for Migration Control. And it was run by somebody who's just happened to be close to Reform UK, who has got these very dodgy statistics, a lot of which look like they'd been pulled out of thin air. And then that publication then got printed by all of the different kind of rogues gallery of white ring media outlets to then be able to push this anti-migrant narrative to keep people engaged. Because, of course, that gets people involved in reform. It gets people involved in being continual readers and purchasers of these right-wing media outlets. And it, of course, helps the right-wing influencers as well, who rely on generating clicks to ensure they have a stream of revenue too. So there is a material basis for the need to become a viral sensation, I guess, and needs to generate those clicks that is the basis for most of this, in my opinion.
And I think as well, the way that, you know, the way that this is going is that basically the right is trying to say that all crime in this country is a result of immigrants and refugees. All sexual assault. That's basically where they're going. Lots of people. Not all of them. There are some thoughtful people who say, you know what, it's bad enough. We don't need to add to it. Okay. Even if proportionally it's less coming from these guys, why? Okay. But there are some people who like, Britain before this never had sexual assault, never had crime. And I find this so strange because for me personally, I live in quite a densely populated city, the second most densely populated city in this country. And I walk down the street and I totally get why people have criticisms of HMOs. I do too. If I could wave a wand, all those HMOs would become family homes or they'd become flats for friends and partners to live in, right? Not HMOs, these atomized, horrible places, profit maximizing shoeboxes in which people have to pass their time. Awful places. But I walk down my road and I see, there's a building which has got 5 or 6 young guys drinking outside it, topless, no clothes. And I'm told it's a halfway house. And the licensing for that is no different to a regular HMO, which I find astonishing, right? You could be living in your house with 2 kids and the next day you've got 8 dudes. And again, no problem. By the way, is it really going to help them rehabilitate if 8 of them are getting pissed all the time in the same building? But forget that for one moment. That's a licensing issue, right? That's a licensing issue. That's about the state not providing adequate resources to deal with an illness properly. But in any case, all those guys are white British, right? I walk down the road. I go to a park near where we live. Again, people with substance abuse issues, drinking in the park, sometimes quite abusive to people, sometimes quite violent to people. It's been an ongoing issue. Again, all white British. That shouldn't be a surprise because this is a part of the world which is overwhelmingly white British. But I see all that and then I go on my phone and all I see is people saying that all the crime in this country and all the antisocial behavior is all because of brown and black people. And I just think, what planet are you living on? I'm looking around. I'm looking at my phone. It's like a distorted reality field. And I do think lots of people are falling prey to it. Now, that doesn't mean that brown and black people don't commit any crime. I'm not saying that. Doesn't mean that some refugees don't break the law or work illegally or commit sexual assault. I'm not saying that. And the people that do that should be dealt with and punished. 100%. And if there are structural issues, then of course you look at them structurally. I'm perfectly happy to do that. But this bizarre self-psyop that's going on with the right, trying to tell the rest of society that crime and substance abuse and antisocial behavior is all the issue of brown and black people, is racism. It is racist. There's literally, we have a word for that. It's called racism. When I'm on the train in the quiet zone and somebody's playing their phone, the last time that happened, by the way, it was a white middle-class lady with a very expensive bag and she was just listening to her voicemails out loud on the phone. But if you go on X, it's all brown and black people. And by the way, I hate that behavior, whoever does it. Some people even call me Bastani because I'm becoming so boring and small c conservative and things like that. But this lens through which to look at problems in society is clearly becoming increasingly pervasive. And yes, in these instances, they're talking about refugees and asylum seekers, but it's a more broad way of looking at the world, I think, anyway, with regards to people who are from minorities. And they're to blame for everything that's going wrong. And that's a very old story. It's a very old story, and it doesn't end in a very good place. My thanks to Simon Shards for the reporting on this story. You can see more about it on the Novara Media website. That's at novaramedia.com. We've reported extensively on the BBC documentary Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone. The film follows the lives of 3 children and one 24-year-old mother in the Strip as they endure airstrikes and mass evacuations. And the BBC took it down just 2 days after publishing it. The reason? It emerged that one of the documentary's subjects, a 13-year-old boy, was the son of Hamas' deputy agriculture minister. And a recent BBC review found that not disclosing that breached editorial guidelines. The journalist who alerted the BBC to that connection is one David Collier. In March, he told the Times of Israel that he caught the BBC, quote, in bed with Hamas. I mean, that's just extraordinary. And in that interview, Collier also said this. They tried to appear neutral by equating a liberal democracy with an Islamist terror organization. They pretend that Hamas and the Palestinians are 2 completely separated entities, as if Hamas is some alien invasion power dropped from the sky. Nothing to do with Palestinians. They do the same with Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon. Somewhere halfway between Hamas and Israel are the normal Palestinian civilians. So all media attention is focused on them. Now Collier has told us a little bit more about what he stands for on the social media platform X. Important to understand why Keir Starmer will recognise Palestine, even though it harms our allies, sets back peace and rewards terrorism. Because the Labour Party is running scared of the Muslim vote. You may as well accept it. Islamists are now driving UK foreign policy. Just to hammer that home, here's another post. So Keir Starmer is going to recognise Narnia in September. Of course, Narnia being a fictional land. And he intends to introduce the definition of Islamophobia. So if Hamas do another October 7th, we will be called Islamophobes for criticising it. This won't change anything in the Middle East, but the UK is so lost. I mean, first of all, I'm not opposed to Palestinian self-determination. I believe in it. But you're then comparing it to a place which literally doesn't exist. Which literally doesn't exist. And this motif of saying, well, Palestine is like Hamas, they're the same thing. Well, Israel, as I'll talk about more in a moment, was founded on violent Zionist terrorism from the 1940s onwards. Actually, you go back to the 1920s. But from the 1940s onwards, it got really, 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 really bad. Really bad. But presumably, David Collier would say, well, we shouldn't just have the Irgun and the Lehi and the far-right ultranationalist Zionist terrorists. That's not the same as Jews living in Israel. They're two separate things. Surely, David, what is good for the goose is good for the gander. Here's how Novara Media's Ash Sarkar responded. This person is who the BBC has been letting dictate their... I mean, this is crazy, right? When you read it out loud. Letting dictate their editorial policy on the Gaza Medics documentary. Unimaginable that someone who talks about being scared of, quote, the Jewish vote would be taken seriously in the way that David Collier is. Completely true. They say the people that say the Muslim vote are the same people if you say, well, the Jewish vote, they say, oh my God, you anti-Semite. Once you start this game of certain interest groups, and you might think we shouldn't be doing that, right? You might be like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. No special interest groups based upon things like ethnic background, right? Kind of the French model is a bit like that as well, the Republican French model. Once you start saying, well, the British Jewish community think this, their religious leaders think this, we have to listen to them, they're a minority, which is, by the way, what happened in the 2019 general election. You had the chief rabbi in the week before the general election piping up alongside the Archbishop of Canterbury. You can't say, well, this one little special interest group over here, they can say what they like. But if other people behave in a similar way, well, that's bad. That's bad. They're taking over politics. It's either one or it's none. It's all or none, rather. Of course, the problem is that cat's out of the bag, right? Or don't you dare criticize Israel because apparently these British Jews think that that's, racist, even though many of them don't think that. I know because I speak to them. Helena, your thoughts?
So broadly, I don't think that this is very specific to Mr. Collier. I think that we've seen a large amount of kind of pro-Israel sentiment in this country has been driven by this idea, essentially, that the whole point of this conflict is driven by Islamism. That's been the line that's been gone with. This is what you heard, again, from people like Isaac Herzog when they did the whole Hamas equals ISIS stuff, right? They're trying to get people, especially in the West, to only think of the kind of opposition, the resistance to occupation within Palestine as being part of the fact that the people who are doing those resistance in a lot of cases are Muslims. Not in all cases, of course. There are secular groups as well, of course. But that's what they're trying to say. Well, look, they're Muslim. The terrorists that attacked the United States and the UK, for example, they were Muslims too. Therefore, they're both coming from the same position. And you can see that from what the first statement made in the Times of Israel piece that you read out there, which was this idea that, well, there is Hamas as an entity of the Palestinians is birthed out of an ideological position that these people take. This is a very kind of liberal understanding of how movements can come to be. When, of course, what this completely ignores is the material dispossession of Palestinians, the material relationship between Israel and Palestine, the material reality of the occupation, and, of course, the funding of Hamas, the deliberate funding by allowing money to go through Qatar into into the coffers of Hamas, but that was facilitated by Benjamin Netanyahu to try and divide the West Bank and Gaza, to try and make sure there wasn't a Palestinian state. There are material basis for these things, because, of course, whilst Hamas and PIJ, for example, are Islamist groups in terms of their own personal ideology, that is secondary to, especially in Hamas's terms, their personal desires and goals, which is Palestinian nationalism. That is what drives it. And a lot of this distortion of the reality of the goals and the aims and the driving force behind Palestinian resistance, by trying to conflate it with kind of the desire for Islamic expansionism that comes from groups like ISIS, is done to essentially create a culture of fear, to try and make people not believe in Palestinian emancipation, as far as I can see. That's my opinion of the narrative that is being spun. And again, I'm not trying to say that this is specific to David Collier. I think this is a broader pro-Israeli narrative that comes from a lot of different people. But what I'm trying to say here is that if you really want to ensure that things like Hamas don't happen, then you have to ensure there's no occupation. And the start of that, the start of the lack of an occupation, is the recognition of a Palestinian state. Like, if you want to ensure that you undermine quote unquote Islamists or jihadists or terrorists or whatever, then you've got to give them a reason not to do terror. You've got to give them a reason you've got to change the material basis for which those attacks are fomented, which is, of course, the basis of the occupation and the dispossession of Palestinians that has been going on for the last 80 years.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. I mean, just looking again at Collier's tweets, because the Labour Party is running scared of the Muslim vote. Keir Starmer did what he did because he was going to lose backbenchers. At least 150, maybe 200 were going to vote for recognition of a state of Palestine. Now, of course, some of those people live in seats where there's a very large Muslim vote, of course. Others of them, and actually most of them, are MPs in seats with a smallish majority, and they know that this issue will kill them as MPs. Not literally, it'll kill their political careers. They will lose their seats. If you're somewhere where you have a 5,000 majority and the Greens and the New Left Party are going to make hay, quite rightly, with this issue, then, of course, you're going to do everything in your power to try and stop you losing your seat. That's kind of how democratic politics is meant to work. Apparently not. Apparently it's all a big conspiracy. And this other one as well, about a new definition of Islamophobia, which by the way, I don't agree with. I don't agree with it. But he's saying if Hamas do another October 7th, if you criticize them, you'll be called Islamophobes. What on earth do you think the IHRA is? What do you think it is? What do you think it is? The IHRA has its definition of anti-Semitism includes certain examples with regards to criticism of Israel. It tries to roll in criticism of Israel into broader framings of anti-Semitism. You're literally, I don't know if this is projection. It must be right. You are literally talking about how free speech is limited when it comes to Israel through discourses of anti-Semitism, which actually aren't anti-Semitism. It's criticizing Israel. They're two separate things. And by the way, the same people say it's anti-Semitic to conflate Israel and Jewish people. They're right to say that. But then, of course, they actually say, well, no, they kind of are the same thing. Since Keir Starmer joined international calls to recognize a Palestinian state, many pro-Israel voices have accused the Prime Minister of rewarding terrorism. Here's Matt Goodwin making a version of that argument on GB News.
What it is going to do effectively is incentivize not just Hamas and not just radical violent Islamist groups across the world who will now conclude that actually violence and terrorism gets you what you want. But here's what I'm really concerned about beyond all of that, which is enough to be concerned about, is it's also going to inspire every other would-be terrorist across Western nations and push them to the conclusion that if they use violence, if they use rape, if they use torture, if they use murder, that they will, in the end, be able to get what they want out of Western states. I think Keir Starmer has been pushed into this because he's more concerned about Muslim votes than he's concerned about British people and also the rights and security of Israel and British Jews. And I think it is cold calculation on his part to reach this decision. I completely, firmly oppose it.
Now, I don't often do this, but I was actually also on that panel and I was having this conversation with Matt, and it's bad form to blow your own trumpet, but I think it's a really, really important conversation. Here's what happened next.
Everything Matthew's just said could have been said about the state of Israel in 1949 when we recognised it.
If you look in 1947, there was the Sergeants' Affair, very famous image, people can Google this at home, of two British sergeants who were hanged by the Irgun, a Zionist militia. One of their bodies was booby-trapped, and when they were cut down, another officer was quite badly injured. About 600 service personnel and police officers were killed in what was then called the Mandate of Palestine by Zionist militias, terrorist atrocities like the bombing of the King David Hotel. And that all happens between 45 and 48. And like I say, we recognised the State of Israel in 1949, legally. So everything Matt just said about how, well, if you recognise this state, it will be succour to terrorists, it will legitimise the kinds of tactics they adopt. The exact same thing could have been said about the State of Israel in the 1940s.
Since
it could. It is literally, and you might say, well, we shouldn't have recognised the State of Israel. It is literally play for play the same. Helena, apart from telling me that I'm wrong because Britain recognised Israel legally in 1950, de facto recognised it in 1949, I got one word wrong, I'm afraid. But apart from that, what did you make of our conversation?
I mean, I wouldn't even say that it's play-by-play the same, because at no point have the Palestinians in their time as looking for a two-state solution, for example, even in their calls for one-state solution, like none of these particular desires have come at the expense of the Israelis or Jewish people or citizens of Israel being removed from the area at all. Even Osama Hamdan, a member of the Hamas Politburo, said, we welcome anybody to live in the future state of Palestine as long as they agree to follow the rules. It doesn't matter what race or religion they are, as long as they adhere to the laws of the land, right? And that's a member of the Hamas Politburo who said that. Whereas the recognition of the state of Israel in terms of self-determination, which is what this is based upon, Palestinians have a right to self-determination within especially the areas that they currently reside, that they've been pushed into that by the expulsions that took place in 1948, right? The creation of Israel as a reward for terrorism was explicitly worse, because it wasn't just a reward for terrorism, it was a reward for ethnic cleansing. It was a reward for driving the citizens of Lida and Ramla from their houses at gunpoint and sent on death marches to Ramallah to be able to create a unitary ethno-state. So the recognition of the state of Israel, in my mind, was a reward for not just terrorism, but for ethnic cleansing, specifically so because they wanted to maintain a demographic majority. And the Palestinians of today, they're not seeking to do any of that. The majority of the plurality opinions, or when you poll people in the West Bank and Gaza, is for a separate second Palestinian state. I think they've realized that trying to reclaim all of the territory of Palestine is unlikely as a population, even if the political leaders seem to believe that they want to have a unitary state in the future. Again, I'm ambivalent to the solution myself. But in that situation, they just want the 1967 borders in a lot of cases to be what constitutes a Palestinian state for where they currently live, which again, as far as I'm concerned, they have the right to self-determine themselves for that, because that is where they were ethnically cleansed to. Whereas Israel have gone far beyond anything that has been done by any Palestinian militant organization from 1948 until now during the Nakba, which is what we rewarded by recognizing them, by saying, well, there are no Palestinians left apart from the ones that are an Arab minority in what you've declared to be the state of Israel post-1948 war. So yes, fine, we'll just recognize that. That's cool. Just forget the ethnic cleansing thing. That's fine. I'm like, what? Excuse me? That's a crime against humanity that you're rewarding there. So again, the recognition of Israel it's even further down the line in my mind.
I mean, here's something I should have said in that short snippet. Would have been a great anecdote for a GB News audience. Zionist terrorists were so off their rocker in the 1940s, they even proposed to assassinate Winston Churchill. Matter of record. Google it. Irgun Churchill assassination. They killed, what was his name? Lord Moyne, a government minister in Cairo. Lord Moyne. Of course, they killed a Swedish diplomat who was working on behalf of the UN. They killed hundreds, as I said in that clip, hundreds of police officers and service personnel in the Mandate Palestine. Now, if you were Israeli, even if you were a liberal Zionist, you might say, well, those people were treating Jewish settlers and Zionists very badly. So the Sergeants' Affair, where those two sergeants were hanged, that was after there was the execution of 3 members of the Irgun who were planning to carry out a terrorist attack, right? So it was a tit-for-tat thing. The British were doing the exact same thing to the Arabs. You have the Arab uprising in the 1930s. I think it culminates in 36. The exact same thing. So this idea that the British were attacking Zionist settlers, etc., is simply not true. They were trying to maintain something resembling a rule of law in a place where the former state, the Ottoman Empire, had collapsed, and you had these competing claims on sovereignty, the most violent of which, by far, came from a small minority of Jewish settlers, particularly violent Zionists. And their terrorism worked. It worked. It succeeded. Here's another great fact. Alongside the Churchill one, which, my God, right? That is game, set, and match, you'd think. One of the first examples of a Spitfire, as in a Supermarine Spitfire, the iconic plane of the Second World War for the UK, one of the first examples of a Spitfire shooting down a Spitfire was Israeli pilots using Spitfires to shoot down British Spitfires. We ain't taught that, folks. We ain't taught what happened in the 1940s in the Mandate of Palestine. And we ain't taught that for a reason. Partly it's to do with race, and it's to do with anti-Arab and anti-Muslim sentiment, which is pervasive amongst our elite in this country. And partly because, over many decades, our rulers, our elites, view Israel as a useful tool in the extension of foreign policy interests in that part of the world. That is particularly the case in the United States. But we're now coming to a moment, I think, where accuracy, history, the facts are coming to the fore. More than that, you can't ignore this stuff anymore. Something strange is happening to Tucker Carlson. This is from his interview with political scientist and international relations scholar, John Mearsheimer.
And in fact, if you go back and read the literature on the creation of Israel, this is all thoroughly documented. Ethnic cleansing was a subject that the Zionists talked about from the get-go, and they talked about extensively, because there was no way they could create a greater Israel without doing massive ethnic cleansing. You want to remember that when the Zionists come to Israel, starting in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there are remarkably few Jews in Palestine. And those Jews are not Zionists. The Zionists are the Jews who come from Europe.
Right.
And they understand that they're moving into a territory that's filled with Palestinian villages and Palestinian people. And the question you have to ask yourself is, how can you create a Jewish state on a piece of territory that's filled with Palestinians without doing ethnic cleansing, massive ethnic cleansing? And the answer is you can't. So they're talking about and thinking about ethnic cleansing from the get-go. So the idea that they wouldn't think of what the situation looks like after October 7th is an opportunity to do ethnic cleansing, it belies.
So it wasn't really a land without people for a people without land.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Classic Carlson, isn't it? He says something, which he knows it wasn't a land for people that land. He knows that's not. So what you're telling me is this thing I already know. Anyway, it's a nice sort of personality tick. It's quite amusing. There's, of course, the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which is the starting gun for the State of Israel. At that time, I think about 7% of the population of Palestine, 7% was Jewish. Mostly settlers, but of course you have very long-standing Jewish communities there as well for literally thousands of years. 7%. And in that document, published in 1917, Palestinians and Arabs aren't mentioned once. It's not mentioned once. It refers to existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. In other words, 93% of the people living there. One day later, Carlson went on to interview retired US Green Beret Tony Aguila, who worked in Gaza as an aid contractor.
How did the Israeli military, the IDF, treat Palestinian civilians?
I could describe it as nothing more than they treated them like animals. Even the UG Solutions and the SRS personnel on the ground, what was concerning to me, because I witnessed this in years of Iraq, when you get down the road and you start describing people in a certain way, you start to dehumanize them. Even the U.S. contractors on the ground called them the zombie horde. The IDF, and in some cases we, don't recognize these people as human beings. And part of my why I want to talk and come out in this is because I saw these human beings. I was there. This photo here, this is on site 1. That's a human being. I took this photo. This didn't come from some far left journalist or from the Gaza Health Ministry. I took that picture. This here. These are the people that we're dehumanizing, that we're killing in mass scale, that we're depriving of food and water, that we are torturing in a way because they're not eating it all. And we're calling them all Hamas. That's what we're calling them.
Really powerful stuff there. Helena, what did you make of these 2 clips that came from Tucker Carlson just a moment ago? I mean, talking about quite different things to 2 different people, but there's a pattern here of actually quite powerful conversations which are exerting massive influence right now over American politics.
I think got to remember that Tucker Carlson is a follower and not a leader. He follows where he believes that the dial is turning towards. He's always kind of been like a MAGA loyalist in reality, right? He's always stuck with the basis of that campaign. But I think he understands where the tide is turning to and wants to make sure that he's providing output that he can be popular with. Of course, he is on his own now. He is an independent journalist, since being untied from Fox News, where he admitted himself in his time at Fox News, he was just doing what the oligarchs and the media barons told him to say. He was happy to follow their instructions. But now that he has to rely on his own base rather than a salary, he's got to ensure that he is following where he is being led to. And given that the MAGA base is really falling out with Israel, again, not for anti-Zionist reasons, I think it's really important to understand there is no principle that is anti-Zionist towards the reason why a lot of the MAGA base, especially the young people that Tucker Carlson wants to connect with, are moving away from Israel, right? It's not even necessarily isolationism. I think a lot of these people would support, for example, military intervention in the South China Sea, for example. But in terms of what Israel represents to them and the relationship what it represents is essentially what they see as another country leading the America that they believe should be America first, around in terms of geopolitics. We'll follow Israel into Gaza. We'll follow Israel as they commit war crimes. We'll follow Israel into Lebanon. We'll follow Israel into Syria. We'll follow Israel into Iran. And this is the same kind of forever war that they were told they were never going to get under a Trump presidency. When you look at, for example, Tucker Carlson in his speech for the kind of a Turning Point USA convention, or indeed a really interesting conversation he had with Ben Shapiro, where he actually does kind of support the kind of the baseline economic desires of the people who voted MAGA and understands their concerns. That he understood that we can't buy a house, you can't buy a car. A lot of Americans are falling away from the American dream, right? He was really, in this clip with Ben Shapiro, he opposed them, for example, wanting to replace truck drivers with self-driving trucks because it would cause societal chaos and they'd lose loads of jobs in the way that loads of jobs have already been lost, right? This is a guy who understands where these kind of narratives and these kind of beliefs are going. And if he wants to maintain a listener base and a viewer base, he has to know where this is going to go. And so given that we are seeing an American president, we're seeing an American administration, one that wants to project itself as being a strongman, essentially being allowed to be pulled around on a leash by Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel, and indeed the Christian Zionists, who are the real power brokers behind the scenes, behind the Trump administration, the neocons who are the ones actually diverting policy on this, ones being the progenitors of policy, because it's far above Netanyahu and Trump. That doesn't scream the America First strongman that these MAGA voices represented, or these MAGA voices wanted to elect into office. And Tucker Carlson knows this. He's not an idiot. As you say, he's very happy to play an idiot to try and ensure that people think that he is learning things on the spot when he knows it already. But he knows that that's what his base wants to hear. We saw what happened when this base reacted to the Netanyahu and the Nelk Boys podcast. They were outraged, right? That's the base that he wants to try and win over. He's already guesses himself with the Nelk Boys to try and gain this audience too. And it doesn't bode well for the Christian Zionists in America. It doesn't bode well for the neocons and the American unipolarity enjoyers in America if not even Tucker Carlson is on side anymore.
Yeah, I mean, the question is why? I mean, there's a few theories. I mean, why is he following these people? Why is he following the sentiment of his audience? Precisely in order to quote unquote lead them. One is, I think he wants to go into politics. And the guy's 56. I think he probably wants to go into politics. He's achieved everything you want to achieve as a conservative journalist in American life. He was at Fox. He's now doing his own thing. He's got a big profile. Where else is there to go? So I would not be surprised if 5-10 years from now, he finds himself in a political arena. Trump's not going to be around forever. Apart from J.D. Vance, there aren't really many people, or the Trump kids, there aren't many people you can look around and think, well, they'll be the ones to pick up the baton. Of course, those people will come to the fore now, but I think for the most part, a lot of figures who will try and take that mantle will be coming out of the media. Charlie Kirk, and I think Tucker Carlson are two of them. There are other theories too, of course. You know, he's really working for the CIA. He's trying to implement and shape policy in accordance with the interests of the deep state, break with the status quo of the post-war era. I mean, maybe there's no evidence for it, but it's certainly a big shift to be talking to people like Tony Aguilar and John Mearsheimer about these things. Before we go, let's just look quickly at a graphic from Trita Parsi, friend of the show. He posted this on X. I mean, this is really, really powerful. Really powerful. Just spent an hour and a half in a small group with Tony Aguilar, the former Green Beret and contractor at the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, who has blown the whistle on all of the war crimes that GHF and the Israeli Defense Forces are committing. So this is the chap that was just speaking to Tucker Carlson. Trita saying, I just spent 1.5 hours with him, behind the curtains, private conversations. I am shook to my core. There is so much that will come out. And as Tony said, a day of reckoning will come when the entire world will know what has happened, and the US, but also the UK too, role in it. Nuremberg will follow. Trita is not a hyperbolic guy. He's a very, very calm person. For him to arrive at that conclusion, I would suggest, means it's probably warranted. Helena, thanks for joining me tonight.
I mean, I'll just add one thing on to the end of that, which is that when Zara Sultana tweeted out that David Lammy would end up in The Hague, people scolded her for being unserious, including Rupert Lowe. They said that it was student politics, go back to your student union. When this is very similar, almost identical, in fact, to the same statement that was made by Kit Malthouse, the Conservative MP, in the House of Commons to David Lammy's face, saying, you're not worried about ending up at The Hague. And I think that tweet from Trita Parsi is very similar in those same veins. People in the West have been sheltered. They've been sheltered from the consequences of their actions and the consequences of their belligerence and the consequences for their support for these kinds of brutalities. And I do believe a day of reckoning will come. And people like Zara, people like Kit, people like Trita Parsi, they'll be vindicated in the end. History will absolve them.
Yeah. Yeah. You're looking at criminal charges, okay? Assisting a genocide is a war crime. It's illegal. I mean, that was the legal basis that the Yemenis and the Houthis in Yemen, were giving. That under international law, they're obliged to stop a genocide. That was their argument. I think legally, in the not too distant future, they're going to reflect on that. And they're going to say, wow, we were more right than even we realized. And I think a lot of other countries who've criticized them might even join in too. Thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. Come back on Monday for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Have a great weekend and good night.